Hello and welcome to the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development's video, Lead-Based Paint Violations, Understanding Work Dates and Documentation Dates. This video is brought to you by HPD's Office of Enforcement and Neighborhood Services. And in this video, we're going to explain to you some important concepts for understanding HPD's requirements to clear lead-based paint violations. And we will also show you how to look up violations for any building using HPD's online databases to understand what it's going to take to clear those violations. Before we get into the main presentation, I'm going to share a quick disclaimer with you. This presentation is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. This presentation is not a complete statement of building owners' responsibilities relating to lead-based paint or any other topic. And our target audience for this video is building owners who are already somewhat familiar with our lead-based paint violations process. On our website, we have a number of recorded webinars which you can view, and I'd particularly recommend that you look at our lead-based paint violations webinar if you are not familiar with this topic already, and watch that in conjunction with this video. Otherwise, parts of this video may be hard to understand. We're talking today about New York City's Local Law 1 of 2004 as amended. There may be other applicable regulations in some instances, but we aren't talking about those today, and we will cover those in future videos and webinars. And last, this presentation is intended as a general guide to HPD's process for issuing and clearing lead-based paint violations under New York City's Local Law 1 of 2004 and its amendments. The following are simplified representations of HPD processes for educational purposes. The dates and other details do not reflect all aspects of or possibilities within HPD's enforcement processes, and owners must carefully read all of the instructions in notices of violation and other HPD guides and materials and use their own judgment to adapt what we show you here in this video today in order to comply fully with the law. All right, now that we've covered the disclaimer, let's move into our video. We're going to have 3 sections of this video. Each one will build upon the last. The first part, we'll talk about the basics of clearing lead-based paint violations, some basic concepts and ideas. In the second part, we'll talk about how those concepts and ideas influence the work dates that HPD will require for clearing a violation. And in the third part, we're going to show you how to research the status of any lead-based paint violation using HPD Online. Moving into part 1, the basics. HPD requires 2 things in order to clear a lead-based paint violation: a re-inspection to make sure that the work has been done to correct the condition the violation was written for, and paperwork to show that that work was done properly. Let's get into detail here, a little more detail. So HPD uses both of those things, the re-inspection and the paperwork, to ensure that the law was followed. So a lot of different things have to happen in order for the law to be followed relating to a lead-based paint violation. The work has to be done, of course, but it has to be done using required safe work practices, required correction methods, required methods of clearance, which means making sure that the work site was cleaned of dangerous lead-based paint dust. And the work has to have been done using independent contractors with certain kinds of certifications. And as we can see, some of these things, the inspector will be able to confirm visually, mostly was the work done, and in some cases, was the work done using the right correction methods. But for many of these other things, the inspector can't simply see whether these were followed by revisiting the violation location. And that's why HPD requires paperwork to confirm that the law was followed in all of these respects. To go into a little more detail, let's step back and look at a familiar example. And we're going to illustrate the idea of authentication, which basically means how do we know something is what it appears to be? And to do that, we're going to look at a collector signed baseball card. In this case, this is a signed Babe Ruth baseball card. If it's real, it's very old and very valuable. How do we know it's real though? How do we know it is what it appears to be? How do we know it's authentic? That's where this word authentication comes from. We can look at it. Of course, we would never want to buy it or accept it if we couldn't see it first. And we can check the paperwork and history. So there are those 2 methods. If it's clearly not a real Babe Ruth signed baseball card, as in this example you see on the screen, then even if the paperwork looks okay, even if the paperwork looks valid, we can't accept it. And we can't use that paperwork for anything else either. Similarly, even if it looks good, it looks real, as far as we can tell from looking at it, it looks like the real thing. If there's a problem with the paperwork, as we can see in this example, then we can't accept it. In this case, the paperwork appears to be from a children's game, and it also says void on it. So clearly, even though this card may look good, the paperwork that was provided is not good, and so we cannot accept that this card is real without the right documentation. We need both things, to see it for ourselves and to review that paperwork. So lead-based paint violation correction is similar to this example that I just presented to you. HPD's inspectors have to visually confirm on a re-inspection that the work was done, and HPD's staff have to review the paperwork the owner submits to make sure the work was done in the right way. So now let's look at how this plays out in practice and how these requirements affect the work dates that HPD will accept in order to clear a lead-based paint violation. The key concept here is that when an owner submits paperwork to HPD, that paperwork has to document the same work that the inspector saw when they came back to the violation location and re-inspected. Both have to attach to the same work, the re-inspection and the paperwork. So to illustrate this, let's look at a little timeline that I'm going to create to show you which work dates HPD would accept to clear a violation. First, anytime an inspector sees that a condition exists, in other words, they see that there's a lead-based paint hazard, HPD will not accept any work that was done before that date to correct the condition. This should be obvious. Whatever work happened before this date, it did not fix the condition that the violation documented, and so HPD will not accept that work for clearing that violation. HPD will only accept work done after the date that an inspector saw that there was a problem. Now, anytime an inspector sees that a condition was corrected, HPD is also not going to accept any work for clearing that violation that's after this date. Why? Because any work that was done after this date, it may have been good work, it may have been bad work, but it is not the work that the inspector saw. It is not the same work that that inspector reviewed. And so HPD will not accept this work either unless the owner wanted to arrange another re-inspection. So it's really very simple. HPD will only accept work to clear a lead-based paint violation that occurred in between the time that the inspector saw that there was a problem and the time that the inspector saw that the problem had been corrected. Now, this is a fairly simple concept, but it can become complicated in the different ways that it can play out. And so to illustrate this and help you understand, I'm going to give you an example that I call the long and winding lead-based paint violation. This is going to be a violation that's going to take 4 tries to clear, and we're going to follow it from the time the violation was written to the time that it was cleared, and you'll see some different patterns that can happen in how the violation clearance can go. So first, we're going to put another timeline here, and we're going to start our example with a violation that was written. A violation is a type of situation where an inspector saw that there was a lead-based paint hazard. They saw that the condition exists. And now in our example, our owner that we're using for our example tried to clear this violation by submitting paperwork for work that was done before the date the violation was written. And as we just discussed, HPD will never accept work done before a date that the inspector saw there was a problem in order to clear a violation. And so this paperwork cannot help this owner clear the violation. The owner is going to have to start over. Now, in the second attempt, in this case, the owner started off by arranging work for after the date that the inspector saw the problem, so that's a good start. And in our example, this owner submitted valid paperwork, which means that all of the licenses and documentation were correct and acceptable to HPD, so that's another good start. However, in this example, a new leak appeared in the apartment and caused the paint to deteriorate again. And so as a result of this, when the owner arranged a re-inspection, the inspector returned and saw that the condition still existed. And so as a result of that, the re-inspection was not complied because again, HPD will never accept work to clear a violation that was dated before a time an inspector saw that there was a problem. And so the owner is going to have to start over once again. By the way, I should quickly mention that as we can see, because we have this new date that an inspector saw that a condition exists, now this previous date that the violation was written is less important because any date before a time when the inspector saw that there was a problem is not going to be acceptable for clearing the violation. So this new date covers up any previous instances, if you will. And we'll see how that can become important going forward. So now in our third example, in this example, the owner arranged additional work. Now, again, this work was done after the date that an inspector saw that there was a problem, so that's a good start. And now the owner arranges a re-inspection, and that re-inspection is complied, which means this requirement is taken care of. As far as the inspector can see, the work has been done to fix the condition properly. However, in this example, there's a new problem, which is that the contractor has lost the paperwork. And so without documentation, this work and clearance cannot be used, even though it looks good to the inspector. And this is where it can be helpful to think back to our baseball card example. If we cannot obtain documentation that proves that the work was done properly, that proves the history of that work, then the work cannot be used to clear the violation, even if it appears to be good. So this owner cannot use that work to clear this violation, and they're going to have to try again. All right, now let's move on to our fourth and final attempt. In this situation, the owner has arranged, again, for additional work after the last date that there was a problem. So far, so good. The re-inspection was complied, which means the inspector saw the condition was corrected. And I should mention as an aside that, of course, HPD, as we've discussed, would not accept any work dated after this date. But in our example here, that's not a concern. And the owner has submitted all the proper paperwork for this work that was done right here. And so now our owner has successfully cleared this violation after 4 tries. Now, we hope that it will not take you 4 tries to clear any lead-based paint violation you may be managing, but this long example is a nice way of just explaining some of the different possibilities for how a violation can develop a long history over time. Now, let's use what we just discussed to research the status of violations using HPD Online. So in our previous examples, we had the benefit of being there from the very beginning of this violation. We were there when it was written and we followed it all the way to when it was cleared. But in some cases, we may be trying to understand what has happened to a violation after the fact. So for this example, let's pretend that we are property managers and we've just started a new job at a new property management company, and our new supervisor has given us the task of looking at a building in the company's portfolio, identifying all of the overdue lead-based paint violations, and figuring out what it's going to take to clear all of these violations. So that's our scenario going forward. And to do this, we're going to use HPD Online on the HPD's website. You can navigate to HPD Online easily from the HPD homepage, and it is a very useful database for the public where you can look up any building, any residential building that is in New York City, and you can see a wealth of information. So here we'll search for our building, and then this screen will come up. And now there's a lot of other information here, but for our purposes, we are going to click on overdue lead paint violation correction. And one thing I will mention is that this report only includes overdue violations. For more about what overdue means, see our lead-based paint violations webinar. But if there are any violations that are not overdue, they will not pop up in this report. And again, you can see our other webinar for more details on any violations that are not overdue. So let's look at an example of what we might see when we click on that report. We're going to see an entry here that gives us a lot of information about a particular violation. Now, if the building has no violations, we may see no overdue violations, rather, we may see no entries. If it has many overdue lead-based paint violations, we may see quite a few entries. So in this case, we're just going to look at one of these entries. And as you can see, there is a lot of helpful information here. There is the violation ID number. There's an order number, 617, which tells us that the paint in this case has tested positive for lead content. Again, you can see our webinar for more details on that. The apartment number, a more detailed description of the location of the violation and the component it was written for. In this case, it was a wall. But what we're going to focus on right here is the reported date, the lead affidavit and documents required, the swipes after date, the inspection status, the inspection completed date, and the work after date. These two lines will allow us to create a similar timeline to the ones I've showed you previously that will lay out exactly which requirements still have to be completed and exactly which dates HPD will accept for any paperwork that must be submitted. Anytime we see one of these entries, we're going to start with one question. Why is this violation still open? In other words, which of the two fundamental requirements are still needed before this violation can be cleared? Is it the reinspection? Is it the paperwork requirement? Or maybe it could be both. So let's start here with the reinspection. To find out if we still need a reinspection, we're going to look at the inspection status field. And if it says inspection completed, that means we no longer need a reinspection. If it says inspection required, that means we still need a reinspection. In this example, it says inspection completed. That means that we no longer need a reinspection for this violation. Now let's look at the paperwork requirement, the other of the two fundamental requirements. To determine if we still need to submit paperwork, we're going to look at the lead affidavit and documents required field. If that says no, then that means we don't need to submit any more paperwork. If it says yes, that means we still need to submit paperwork to HPD. In this case, the lead affidavit and documents required field says yes. So what we're looking at here is a violation where we don't need to arrange a reinspection, but we do still need to submit paperwork to HPD. This is going to lead us to a follow-up question. Which work dates will HPD accept for that paperwork? And to answer that question, we're going to look at a few of the other fields. The reported date and the work after date are going to be dates that an inspector saw that the condition existed. So this relates back to that timeline. We sort of looked at how these events affect the requirements. And then the inspection completed date is going to be a date that an inspector saw that the condition is corrected. So now with all of this information together, we can recreate a timeline like the ones that I showed you that is going to explain exactly what we need to do in order to clear this violation. So I'm going to sort of take apart this violation for you and go step by step to show how you could create a timeline yourself using this information. Of course, this is not required for you to do it in the way that I'm doing it. Any way that works for you, of course, great. This is just one way that we can go step by step to make sure that you can follow along and understand what all of this information means. So we're going to create our timeline. I'm going to start by reviewing those two questions. Do we need a reinspection? As we just discussed, inspection completed in the inspection status field means that we do not need a reinspection. And as an aside, because we know that the reinspection is completed, we know that's why we have the inspection completed date, which we'll use in just a little bit for our timeline. And our other question is, do we need to submit paperwork? As we just recalled, this lead affidavit and docs requirement field, if this reads yes, this means we do need to submit paperwork. And now our question is, which work dates will HPD accept for that paperwork? So let's start with these two dates with the red boxes, the reported date and the work after date. As we just discussed, these are dates that an inspector saw there was a problem. And thinking back to our long and winding lead-based paint violation, we saw how the earlier of these dates doesn't really affect the requirements going forward. So we only need the later of these dates. In some cases, maybe you would not see a work after date here. If that were the case, then this reported date might be the latest date. But in this case, the work after date is the latest date that an inspector saw that the condition existed. And so we know that HPD will not accept any work that was dated before this date. Now we just have to go to our inspection completed date. Again, this is the date an inspector saw that the condition was corrected. And so HPD will not accept any work dated after the date an inspector saw that the condition was corrected. So as we've established again, but just to review, instead, HPD will only accept work that's in between the date the inspector saw that there was a problem and the date that the inspector saw that the problem was corrected. In between these two dates. In this case, it's September 18th, 2015, which we brought from our work after date down into our timeline, and July 12th, 2016, which we brought from our inspection completed date down to our timeline. Now you can start to see how one note of advice is it can be important to arrange the reinspection sooner than later in order to navigate this process. The sooner you arrange it, the less chance is that paperwork would be lost or that any other problem could start to make it harder to fulfill all of these requirements and to be able to submit the proper paperwork. Now let's look at another example. This example is going to have a slightly different fact pattern. So in this case, again, we have all the same information in our report, and we're going to ask the same questions. Our main question is, why is this violation still open? Is it because we owe paperwork to HPD or because we still need to arrange a reinspection? So let's start with the reinspection question. Again, we're going to answer that by looking at the inspection status field. And in this case, that field says inspection required, which means we still need a reinspection. Unlike in our last example, in this example, we still need to arrange a reinspection. And one thing I'll mention here is that we'll arrange that reinspection generally by contacting HPD. And again, you can see our other webinar for details on how that's going to work. It may depend a bit on where your violation is in the process, but we won't go into that for now. But just a note, if you're wondering how to make a reinspection happen to clear the violation, you will contact HPD, and there are more details about that in our other resources. Now, do we need to submit paperwork to HPD? Again, we're going to look at our lead affidavit and documents required field, and in this case, that field says no, which means we no longer need to submit paperwork. So for this violation, we still need a reinspection, but we've already submitted paperwork that is acceptable to HPD. And this actually makes our job a little bit simpler in this case, because now that HPD has accepted the paperwork, we don't need to concern ourselves with which paperwork dates might be appropriate, because in the process of accepting this paperwork, HPD has already checked that paperwork for the dates. That's part of our staff's required steps before they accept any paperwork. So HPD has already reviewed the paperwork and found it acceptable. So that means we don't have to do any other research about paperwork dates. However, just a reminder, thinking back to our long and winding lead-based paint violation, if this re-inspection were to be not complied, then the owner would need to start over. The owner would need to submit new paperwork and arrange for new work done and arrange a new re-inspection. So thinking back to that example, and this applies to any violation, as the violation history evolves, depending on what happens, the required dates and the different requirements may change. So just because this field, for instance, says no right now, that doesn't mean it will always say no. There could be instances or other things that will happen that will change this to yes. So as the violation progresses, I'm going to want to continue checking these fields to see the evolving status of the violation. So just to review, here is a nice summary of all of the fields we've just discussed in HPD Online, all in one place. This is a great time to pause the video if you'd like to take a look at all of these fields at your convenience. So just to review once again, there are the two fundamental requirements. That's the first question we're always going to ask when we look at HPD Online violation information is, why is this violation still open? Do we still need a re-inspection? And we're going to use the inspection status field to answer that question. And we've already gone over what the entries mean here. Do we still need to submit paperwork to HPD? And we're going to use the lead affidavit and docs required field to answer that question. And again, we've already gone over what these entries mean. Now, if the answer to the paperwork field is yes, in other words, if we know we still need to submit paperwork to HPD, we're going to have a second question, which is, which dates will HPD accept for the work that is documented in that paperwork? And as a reminder, of course, when we're talking about paperwork dates, we're talking about the dates that the work was done that should be on that paperwork. So this paperwork may have several dates on it of various events, but what we're talking about here is the date that the work was done that should be reflected in that paperwork that we submit to HPD. So we're going to have some dates that represent instances that an inspector saw a condition existed. Most of these fields will either have a date or be blank. If they're blank, that simply means that the event did not take place, and at this time there is no date that we need to concern ourselves with. But if they do have a date, then we can use that to create our timeline as we just reviewed. These would be the dates that an inspector saw there was a condition that existed. And this date, rather, there's only one possible one here. This is going to be the date an inspector saw that the condition was corrected. Now, I want to briefly mention this dust wipes after date. This is a rare field that you're rarely going to see, and so we won't spend much time on it now. But I do want to mention what this is. If you have a date in this field, this means that HPD's emergency repair program visited the apartment in question and re-inspected the violation, and they found that it looks like the work has been done, but that apartment still needs to clear the dust wipe clearance test to ensure that the work site was safely cleaned. Now, again, this is a rare situation, so call the lead-based paint unit if you have questions about this field, if it pops up for your building. One final thing I'll mention about all of this information is that when you click on HPD Online Overdue Lead-Based Paint Violation Correction Report, the top of your screen is also going to present a set of detailed instructions on these fields that will be an additional resource for you, as well as what I have presented here for you today. Okay, this concludes our presentation. Thank you for joining us, and we hope that you found this presentation helpful in understanding how to clear lead-based paint violations with HPD.